Hey guys, welcome back to You Can't Sit With Us. Over the last few episodes, we've talked about a lot of things that try to pull up a chair at our table. Fear, control, pressure, guilt, the need to keep everyone happy. The one thing I've realized is that most of those things don't show up loudly. They don't kick the door open and announce themselves. They settle in quietly, thought by thought, conversation by conversation, little by little. Until one day you realize they become part of the way you think, part of the way you see yourself, part of the way you move through your life. And that's what I want to talk about today, the voice in your head. Because if Psalm 23 teaches us that God prepares a table before us, then I think we have to ask a really important question. Who's talking at that table? I've been asking myself this a lot lately. Because somebody always is. And for some of us, the loudest voice at the table isn't God. It's criticism. It's insecurity. It's fear. It's shame. It's comparison. It's that voice that constantly reminds us of everything we haven't done, everything we should be doing, and every place we think we're falling short. And if we're honest, we've listened to it for so long that it almost feels normal. Maybe it sounds like you're not doing enough. You're behind. You should be handling this better. You're failing as a mom. You're disappointing people. Everybody else seems to have it together except you. And what's dangerous isn't that those thoughts show up. What's dangerous is when they become trusted voices at the table. Because eventually we stop questioning them. We stop asking whether they're true. We just assume they are. When I picture Psalm 23, I don't picture a rushed meal. I picture a table where God is trying to meet us, a place where He's trying to remind us who He is, a place where He's trying to remind us who we are, a place of peace, provision, truth, and relationship. But if you've ever sat down at a table where one person dominates the conversation, you know how difficult it is to hear anyone else. And I think that's exactly what happens in our minds. God is speaking, but criticism keeps interrupting. God is offering peace, but anxiety keeps talking. God is speaking truth, but comparison has the microphone. God is reminding us that we're loved, but shame keeps arguing back. And eventually, we start believing the loudest voice is the right voice, when really it's just the voice we've listened to the longest. I think that's why this matters so much, because the conversation happening inside your head shapes everything. It shapes your confidence, your relationships, your parenting, your marriage, your faith, the way you show up at work, the way you see yourself in the mirror, the way you walk through difficult seasons. And sometimes the person we're hardest on is ourselves. I don't know about you, but I can give grace to almost anybody else. I can understand why somebody made a mistake. I can encourage someone who's struggling. I can remind somebody else that they're doing their best. But when it comes to myself, sometimes the standards are completely different. Sometimes the voice in my own head is harsher than anyone else could ever be. And I think a lot of women can relate to that, especially women carrying a lot. Moms, stepmoms, caregivers, people trying to hold families together, people carrying emotional labor, people trying to keep peace, people trying to do the right thing. We're often hardest on ourselves in the places we care about the most. And because we care so much, the criticism feels justified. But what if it isn't? What if familiar doesn't mean true? That's the thought I've been sitting with lately. Just because a thought has been around for years doesn't mean it belongs. Just because it pulls up a chair doesn't mean it deserves a seat. One of my favorite verses right now is Philippians 4:8. It tells us to think about whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, and praiseworthy. And every time I read that verse, I come back to that first word, true. Not loud, not familiar, not emotional, true. Because not every thought we think is true. Not every fear is true. Not every criticism is true. Not every worst case scenario is true. Not every label we've placed on ourselves is true. Sometimes we simply repeat something long enough that it begins to feel true. But feelings aren't always facts. I can feel behind and still be exactly where God needs me to be. I can feel inadequate and still be enough. I can feel overwhelmed and still be doing a good job. I can feel uncertain and still be moving in the right direction. And maybe somebody listening today needs that reminder, because I think there are people carrying thoughts they've never challenged, thoughts they've accepted as permanent residents, thoughts that have been sitting at the table for years. And maybe it's time to ask, who invited them? Because one of the biggest lessons I've learned through this entire table concept is that I actually have more influence over the conversation than I thought. Not complete control. Thoughts still show up. Fear still visits, and doubt still knocks. Comparison still tries to walk in. But I don't have to hand them a permanent seat. I don't have to let them stay for dinner. I don't have to let them lead the conversation. And honestly, that's freeing. Because discernment isn't stopping every negative thought from entering your mind. Discernment is learning what gets to stay. What gets your attention? What gets your agreement? What gets your energy? Just because a thought arrives doesn't mean it belongs. And maybe that's where we start taking ownership of the table. Not with perfection, not with pretending we never struggle, but by becoming more intentional about what we entertain. I heard a question recently that really stuck with me. Would I let someone speak to my child the way I speak to myself? And honestly, it made me uncomfortable, because the answer isn't always yes. I would never tell my child they're failing because they had a hard day. I would never tell them they're not enough because they made a mistake. I would never tell them they'll never figure things out. I would never tell them they're defined by their worst moment. So why do we speak that way to ourselves? And if we wouldn't speak that way to someone we love, why do we allow those voices so much authority at our table? I think another question worth asking is this. If God pulled up a chair at your table right now, would he speak to you the way you speak to yourself? Would he tell you you're failing? Would he tell you you're not enough? Would he tell you to carry everything alone? Or would he remind you of grace? Would he remind you of truth? Would he remind you that you're loved before you perform? Because sometimes I think we're listening to voices that sound nothing like God, yet we're treating them like honored guests. We're giving them influence, we're giving them authority, we're letting them narrate our lives, and maybe that's why we feel exhausted, because criticism is exhausting, shame is exhausting, fear is exhausting, condemnation is exhausting. You were never meant to carry those things all day, every day. Now, that doesn't mean we ignore our mistakes, and it doesn't mean we avoid accountability. But there's a difference between conviction and condemnation. Conviction says, let's grow. Condemnation says, you'll never change. Conviction draws us toward God. Condemnation pushes us into hiding. And I think a lot of us have confused the two. So maybe this week the challenge isn't to silence every negative thought. Maybe it's simply to question who's speaking. Is this true? Is this helpful? Does this sound like the character of God? Or is this just a familiar voice that's been sitting at the table for too long? Because not every voice belongs there. Not every thought belongs there. Not every fear belongs there. Not every criticism belongs. God has prepared a table, a place where truth, wisdom, grace, peace, growth, and discernment can live. And maybe protecting that table means being careful about who gets a seat. Because around here, we're learning that not everything deserves access. Not everything deserves influence. Not everything deserves a seat at the table. And if self-condemnation has been leading the conversation lately, maybe it's time to gently show it the door. Because self-condemnation You can't sit with us. I'll see you guys next week.